Hey, good day. This is Joe Van Cleve, and this episode of the Typewriter video series, I'm going to talk about using typewriters for other than writing purposes, specifically what I call type-a-sketch. Stay tuned. Well, of course, typewriters are designed for writing. That's why they call them typewriters. But a lot of typewriters have this other feature, and that is many typewriters have this clear or sometimes metal paper guide, and it'll either have a notch, a series of notches, or in this case with this Facet 1620, it'll have these holes. And these were originally designed for typists to put a pen in and either to move the carriage laterally and draw horizontal lines, or to turn the platen knob vertically and make vertical lines. And the purpose for this was to make guidelines and rulings and column lines in handmade documents before the age of Excel and Word and all of the software that we use in the office environment today. So these were like accessory features, convenience features that were built into many typewriters. They serve that purpose quite well, but most people never really considered them to be a primary function of a typewriter, of course. So if we go back a couple months or a month or so back into January of 2017, January 10th to be exact, I was brainstorming some ideas in my office around writing technology, and specifically I was kind of comparing the attributes between handwriting by longhand and manual typing. And I was really brainstorming this for possible subject matter for either a blog article or another video. But in the process of doing this, I kind of decided that I needed to draw like a graphical block diagram or even kind of like a flow chart. And I wanted the text on this diagram to be typed so it was neat. But I also wanted there to be little boxes, text boxes. And instead of typing out the words and then drawing by hand boxes around them afterwards, I decided in this Facet 1620 typewriter, I decided to use this guideline capability that it has with those little holes in the clear paper guide. And so this was just my first rough draft attempt at doing this kind of a flow chart. And what I did is I typed the fields of text, and then I put my blue Bic Crystal medium point ballpoint pen in the little hole of the paper guide, and I drew these boxes and guidelines, and I really like the results. Now, this was a first attempt, and you'll notice, first of all, for instance, the boxes all don't line up. The sides of the boxes aren't lined up. And in retrospect, what I probably should have done is use the tab feature of this typewriter. I could set a tab for the left side of the boxes, set another tab for the right side, do the same for the other column of boxes, and I would have had a lot more of a neat diagram. But it was an interesting first rough draft attempt at doing some kind of a orthographic or orthogonal drawings using a typewriter. So I did that last month, and then I kind of put this drawing aside and didn't really think about it too much. But in the interim period, in the last couple months, you guys know if you've been watching my channel that I've made several videos on the subject of mazes. And I started that because it's a long-term interest of mine that started back in middle school when I was a young kid, and I've probably told you the story of that anyways. I won't go into it, but in the last month or two, I found myself drawing and dabbling in mazes again more than I have for the last decade or more. And I'll give you an example. I'm not only doing mazes, but I'm doing labyrinths, and the difference between the two is a labyrinth is one continuous passage that doesn't have any branching points, and it goes from one point to another, start to finish, if you will. Whereas a maze has branching points and decision points, and you can get lost in a maze. Just the other night, I drew by hand, I drew this labyrinth, and it's drawn in a gel pen and then colored with colored pencil, done by hand. And as you can see, the lines are not exactly straight, but I like the color scheme I was using, and I had this interesting kind of a way of doing this spiral thing. And now this is what I call a line maze, which is to say the lines are the actual passage, not the space between the lines. And the lines cross other lines, and then they make bends at these angles at the corners. And if it's a real maze, it's going to have nodes, connection points specifically drawn. And I've described all this in the other videos. But anyways, so after I drew this labyrinth, which I call Centripetal Labyrinth with Hysteresis 1.0. I don't know why I call it that. But anyways, after I drew that the other night, I started thinking that I pulled out this block diagram again that I showed you that I had made last month. I pulled that out, and my brain started thinking and working and stuff. And then I decided, hey, you know what? A typewriter, a manual typewriter, is kind of like a drafting machine. And what I mean by that is it can draw horizontal lines and vertical lines, an orthogonal grid, relatively straight, pretty straight in fact. The horizontal spacing of the vertical lines is defined by the escapement cog that runs the carriage back and forth. And the vertical spacing of the horizontal lines is determined by the ratcheting of the line advance mechanism. So you have this relatively precise orthogonal vertical horizontal grid capability with a typewriter. It's not just a machine for printing text, but it's a machine that you could use for drawing horizontal and vertical lines with a fair degree of accuracy and repeatability. And if you've ever remembered, if you're old enough to remember manual or mechanical drafting machines, these were these big kind of T-square mechanisms that clamped to the upper left corner of a drafting table, and it had an articulating arm that you could move this around on the table. And some of them just had a horizontal piece, and you had to put triangles on it to make verticals, and others had a 90-degree thing. You could do verticals, and then there was an angle adjustment where you could control the angle and do isometric kind of drawings or whatever. But so I kind of thought the other day, hey, you know what? These manual typewriters are kind of like orthogonal drafting machines. And what I ended up doing today was a prototype of a line maze. I made it with the Facet 1620 typewriter, and this was done with bit crystal ballpoint and the Facet, and I'm using the typewriter for the spacing of the lines to get horizontal and verticals. This particular maze is fairly simple. It has a passageway that leads to the one node, and there's three other passageways coming out of the one node, and one of those eventually leads to the end. And I'm going to have this maze along with this diagram. I'm going to put this on my blog, my joevancleave.com blog for today, and you'll be able to see that maze in a little bit more detail and actually work it if you want to. So what I'd like to do here for a few minutes is thread a piece of paper into this typewriter and show you a few tips about how to use your typewriter for drawing, not mazes necessarily, but for drawing any kind of orthogonal, horizontal, vertical layout of lines. So just very basic. I'm using my little medium point Bic crystal blue pen and some printer paper, just a very inexpensive, cheap printer paper. So you can move the carriage and the point of drawing. You can move the paper four directions, right? Left, right, up, and down. First of all, make sure your pen fits in the hole quite nicely. Now, some typewriters have a notch down here on the little paper scale instead of a hole, but make sure it fits in there. You can use the space bar like that, and you'll have a nicely printed line. And then you can move the paper down to make lines going up, or you can move the paper up to make lines going down, obviously. And then you can also move the paper to the left, move the carriage to the right, move the printing point to the left this way to make lines toward the left. Now, I found when you're drawing any kind of a diagram with a typewriter, it's easy to see the stuff up here that you've already drawn because it's visible. But in the case of a maze where the lines are going down and up and all around the paper, when you're going down with the line, sometimes you don't know how far to go, and sometimes you'll overshoot. You'll go down too far. And because you're using ink pen, you don't want to do that because then you'll have a mess on your hand. So what I find is if you want to draw a vertical line, it's better to look at your diagram and start at the bottom where you want the line to end and spin the platen this way and draw it vertically back up. That works better. The same way, I find it's better to draw lines from left to right. Either the space bar or using the carriage release lever and moving the platen by hand. Now, let me show you a problem if you're trying to draw horizontal lines from right to left, and that is if you're pulling the platen by hand, what you'll find, if I want to stop right there, I release it, the carriage moves back half a space because of the escapement gear, and so I ended up overshooting that mark. So what I found, if you want to draw a line from right to left, and let's say, for the sake of argument, I want to draw a line connecting over to here, what I'll do is I'll draw my line, I'll pull my carriage to the right, and I'll stop before I get to where I want to go. And then I will move the platen over to my ending point, and I'll move it back to the right to complete that line nice and neatly so I don't overshoot it to the left. And the same thing is true, like I say, when you're doing vertical lines. Try doing your vertical line starting from the bottom and work your way back up, because you can see where you're going to stop at a lot easier. Like that. And going back down, like again, you might overshoot, because you can't really see things until they come up on you suddenly. So you can use the space bar to move the carriage to the right, and you can use the backspace key to move one step at a time back. And then the clicking on the ratcheting, each click will bring you up 1 point vertically or 1 point down vertically. I have this, the margins on this facet 1620 currently moved all the way out as far as they'll go outside. And the paper scale on this typewriter starts at what is effectively -10. Here's 0, and it goes up to almost 90, maybe 88. So it has like about 98 characters per line, and it's equivalent to 98 vertical lines you can do, spaced 1 character apart. So if you go and start doing that, you'll see you go 1 space. This is a 10 character per inch pica typeface typewriter, and so you're going to have lines that you can make as tight as they'll be will be 1/10 of an inch apart, right? And the vertical spacing of your horizontal lines is defined by the ratcheting of the line advance. And it's, I don't know exactly what it is in terms of 1/10 of an inch, but you can get an idea here. Let me move this up and show you that it looks like the vertical spacing of the horizontal lines is a little narrower than the horizontal spacing of the vertical lines. So you have this grid that is more like slightly rectangular, right? But that's the finest resolution you can have on on the grid system of this particular typewriter. And so whether it's drawing mazes or any kind of a diagram that uses an orthogonal line system, up, down, left, right, that's the finest resolution you have in terms of where you can position the lines if you're going to stick with the grid system, right? Well, when I was researching thoughts for this video yesterday, I started looking a little bit online thinking, well, you know, everybody's doing computer-aided design and AutoCAD now. So these old mechanical drafting machines that I used back in the early 70s must be really inexpensive, and you could find them really cheaply. But you know what? They're really pricey. I'm surprised that there's a lot of people that apparently still do hand drafting. Maybe not professional draftsmen like for architectural purposes or engineering, but maybe more like graphic artists use them. And I also noticed on places like Amazon, I saw some inexpensive plastic little drawing tables with little kind of a primitive drafting machine kind of a thing that have questionable accuracy and repeatability, but they're upwards of $50 or $100 for a little, you know, 10 by 15 or something little device that doesn't give you a whole lot of room for a bigger drawing. So thinking about that, the fact that you have this mechanical typewriter that'll do orthogonal drawing, and it'll also imprint your lettering for you, right? Like, for instance, in my diagram I showed you earlier, my flow chart, I have those text boxes with text in them, all done with a typewriter. Well, today I was thinking about what other practical use can I apply this technique for other than mazes. I mean, that's not really practical. It's just more of a pastime, a creative pastime. But I began to think, oh, you know, we have this front yard of ours that we want to redesign part of the layout of the front yard this spring. And I might need to draw a layout. And I want the drawing to be, you know, landscape proportions. And I want it to be a fairly normal sized piece of paper. So what I need is a wide carriage typewriter. I have just the one. And so just a few videos ago, a week or two ago, I presented this Olympia wide carriage SM9. And I think I made a comment at the time that I wasn't really sure the practicality of a wide carriage machine. Why would you need to type on the long side of a piece of paper? Well, as it turns out, all of a sudden, I've found a practical use for a wide carriage typewriter, and that would be for drawing my little layouts. Now, I've never done this with this particular typewriter, and it is slightly different. Oops, bumped the camera. It is slightly different in terms of where the little holes are for your pencil, and they go right, the place where you want to put your pen or pencil on this paper table thingy, paper guide I guess you call it, is underneath here, right in here, and right here, adjacent to it. So you'll find on this particular machine it'll be a little bit of a challenge doing that, but let's try to do it anyways and see what we can do here. So with my carriage unlocked, this is the unlocking lever. Carriage unlocked, I'm going to put my pen on the right side pen guide, and now I can draw a big horizontal line across the paper, and then I'll spin the platen. And if the paper was going to feed straight, I would draw the vertical line, and I could continue making my whole rectangle for my yard landscaping project layout. There's a couple things you should know or keep in mind when you're going to be doing this line drawing. First of all, if your typewriter has more than one hole, like this one does for a pen, I would advise sticking with using the same hole all the time. And the reason why is the paper guide may not be exactly perfectly horizontal to the carriage, to the paper, and to the line you're printing. And so if you switch back and forth between the two, you'll find your lines don't line up vertically. So stick with one hole, and then move your margins around out as far as they need to be, so you have, like for instance, if I choose the right hand hole, so you have the full range of motion that you need for your paper with that one hole. Okay? The other thing is, don't press your pen excessively hard against the paper, because what you'll find, and what we saw happen with this sheet of paper just a while ago, is you'll actually be pulling on the paper, dragging it, and if the pressure rollers don't have a firm enough grip on the paper underneath the platen, the paper will actually slip, is what happened here. So draw the line nice and dark, but don't press excessively hard. Now, of course, I was just using a little Bic Crystal ballpoint pen. It's probably not the ideal pen for this application because, you know, ballpoints oftentimes have that problem where the very start of the line, it doesn't start writing immediately. There's maybe like a fraction of an inch where it's a little bit lighter, and you can kind of see that on that little line maze I drew. So you might want to consider more of a technical pen, but make sure whatever pen you're using that the ink doesn't start running due to capillary action in the little hole of the paper guide. You want to make sure that it stays clean and neat and not get all messy. And make sure you're using the right kind of paper for the kind of pen you're using. So for instance, the little maze I drew there was done on that newsprint quality teletype paper roll. And it's real raggy and absorbent, and you don't want to use a wet kind of a marker pen with it because it's going to smear and run. So make sure you're using a good quality art paper with a good quality pen. I think some of the roller balls or gel pens are pretty good for this. But anyways, this is my little non-writing application of manual typewriters, what I call the Type-A-Sketch. It's kind of like using an Etch-A-Sketch toy, except you have the added advantage that you can lift the pen off the paper anytime you want. You're not fixed with a continuous line drawing. But you have the disadvantage where your horizontal and vertical resolution is limited, how close the lines can get together, by the escapement timing on the horizontal and by the line spacing, ratcheting of the vertical. Well, this has been another episode of the Typewriter video series. I hope this brought to your mind some creative ideas about typewriters that is a little bit different from the ordinary, that we can use these things as graphic arts drafting machines. Until next time, you have yourselves a great day.